So maybe let's start by asking you, Sean, because you're an African in America. What do you think this Biden presidency is going to mean for the continent? Is it going to mean anything, any change? Should we be excited? Should we be skeptical? How should Africans approach the change of power in the United States?
Right. You can see me sort of shrugging, kind of like shaking my head, going like, you want me to talk about this? I don't know. I think it's that sort of, there's a cottage industry of like every time an American president comes in or leaves, that people write this kind of post or essay or they write like an op-ed, which is kind of like, you know, I don't know, Barack Obama, what does he mean for Africa? Or now, you know, then it was Trump, and now it's Joe Biden, if you're just thinking of the last three. And it usually, I think, ends up with this kind of sort of symbolic, it's very much symbolic politics. First black president, or, you know, or in the case of Trump, it's like he's not going to do much, or et cetera and so on. But I think the hardcore stuff is really, I don't think much changes usually between American presidents. America, you have to sort of just kind of go back to like why the U.S., how the U.S. thinks about itself and its reason for existing. It thinks of itself as, you know, the most important country in the world, that it is this like shining city on a hill, that it tells people how to be democracies, especially. I mean, as we know, that hasn't worked out so well for them over the last, I would say, like 50, 60 years, although some people think it was very dramatic about 2 weeks ago. So yeah, I think one doesn't expect much. I think it's more whether anything's going to change about how Africa features in how the US's preoccupation right now, which the main one is still, I think, the war on terror. Secondly, I think around energy politics, you can ask, like, you know, like how does Africa feature in that? If you just take war on terror, you could think back to the election in Uganda, which is, I think you heard something from sort of the local ambassador or local representative saying something about Bobi Wine being you know, detained, or saying something about a little bit about irregularities with the election. But in the main, you know, the U.S. goes along. It goes along with Museveni winning power again. So I don't expect much. I think the thing that I've been fascinated about, which we don't read in these sort of like, what does Biden mean stories, is really kind of like who's gonna make money, who are the lobbyists that are gonna become important, what kind of ideological politics is coming in. And there's a publication that I really like more recently that I read called Africa Intelligence, and they ran an interesting story actually, I think about like at the end of last year, called Albright Stonebridge, an incubator for all things African at Biden's disposal. And it's really about a consulting firm called Albright Stonebridge, which was created in the early 2000s by Madeleine Albright. And that's become apparently the go-to place for high-level American officials with African expertise. So Linda Thomas Greenfield, who I think Biden appointed her to the UN, she comes from that place, and a number of other people. And you'll see some strange names pop up there. I think we were speaking about this before the program. I saw Majanki Gumbi, who used to be an advisor to Thabo Mbeki in South Africa, that she's also part of the setup. So I think like those for me is like probably why I think the more interesting things around this happens, which you're not going to read about in these sort of recycled, you know, pieces, which is almost like what do you call that thing where a Mad Lib, where you just put words in, you know, like, I don't know, you replace Liberia with Ghana or something. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's totally correct. I mean, that's exactly my attitude as well. And I think for me that the thing that's sort of driven me insane, especially in South Africa, is that there's a lot of people who are talking about how since Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, is married to a South African woman, Melissa Cohen, they're like,
oh, I didn't even know that.
He's married to a South African woman. And people are like, oh, South Africa and the continent is going to have a mouthpiece in the White House. And I just think that a lot of the excitement about this administration, as you've already indicated, is completely unwarranted. And I think what's interesting to see is how Americans are reacting to the presidency. So a lot of mainstream liberal commentators are celebrating it as some sort of return to normalcy. One line that absolutely annoys me is a lot of people.
What kind of normalcy?
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people are saying, oh, politics can now be boring again because with Trump, it was just too much spectacle, too much chaos, and too much instability. And I think that there's this disjunct between the world that people want to return to, the status quo ante, which, by the way, was also as unstable and as chaotic as the world Trump entered into, and the world that Biden's entering into, which is as chaotic and as unstable. And as that relates to the continent, I think it'll be interesting to see how they're going to treat what is going to be more and more years of instability in Africa. I think that the world over is in this period where citizens across the world are demanding systemic change. And so this return to the mainstream liberal democratic consensus is not possible anymore. And how are they going to respond to that? How's the Biden administration going to respond to another wave of end SARS if it happens? How are they going to respond to the protests we've seen in Tunisia this week on the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring, where a lot of Tunisians are saying nothing has changed? How are they going to respond to this sort of period of permanent discontent and uprising revolt that we're entering into? Are they going to be willing to make the changes that are necessary to encourage other states to make the changes to reform international institutions like the IMF and World Bank? I don't know. So it's just, I'm in a position where I'm feeling like it's really hard to predict.
Here's what I want to see. Here's what I want to see. There's this great video of Joe Biden, I think in 1985 somewhere. It's at a congressional hearing. He's a senator. And it's the discussion is South African apartheid. And George Shultz has to appear before the committee. And Biden, I mean, I'm going to do a very bad impression, but he's like pointing fingers and shouting and saying things like, who are we standing with? Because remember, this is like, Ronald Reagan, Chester Crocker, constructive engagement. South Africa is our kin, like Rhodesia, whatever. Well, Zimbabwe, it was already Zimbabwe, but, that sort of old school white America allied to their white brothers and sisters, I suppose, in Africa. But anyway, so Joe Biden just was like, we need to stand with the people of South Africa, the black people. I was like, if you're not going to do this usual sort of what can we expect? Then the kind of what I want to see is if I could see a little bit of that Joe Biden,